What happens when a troubled mind is released into the world before it's truly ready? When the internal chaos of a person spills into public space, unpredictable, violent, and unprovoked, do we blame the individual or the systems that failed to hold them? On May 23, 2025, in the heart of Hamburg's bustling central station, 18 people were stabbed in rapid succession by a woman carrying a kitchen knife. No lives were lost that day, but the psychological impact left deep and lasting wounds. The attacker, a 39-year-old recently discharged from psychiatric care, moved with purpose, but without reason, striking at strangers as though possessed by an invisible force. There was no warning, no clear target, no shouted message or demand, just the cold steel of a blade meeting skin and the silent unraveling of something that had been building for far too long. Have you ever wondered what truly drives a mind like this? What unseen fracture in reality turns a person into a vessel of such sudden chaos? Stay with me. The truths we are about to uncover go deeper than you might expect. This case is not about spectacle. It's about fragility, disconnection, and the limits of our understanding when mental illness intersects with violence. Let's begin by reconstructing what happened that day, not just through police reports, but through the lens of a psyche on the brink. In cases like this, clarity rarely arrives in neat conclusions. Instead, we navigate fragments, moments of rupture, silences that scream, decisions that seem disconnected from logic but deeply tied to internal storms. If you haven't yet, take a moment to check whether you're subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. This space isn't about easy narratives or headlines. It's about asking the questions others avoid, about exploring minds that unravel in ways both terrifying and revealing. We don't excuse, we examine. And if you value psychological depth over sensationalism, a like can help us continue bringing forward this kind of respectful, layered investigation into the criminal mind. Now, to understand how a single woman, newly released into society, turned a crowded train station into a scene of collective panic, we need to trace the minutes before and after the violence began. The timeline holds more than just events. It holds patterns, warnings, missed chances. Let's step into the fractured sequence of that day, not to relive the horror, but to see what it might reveal about the silent thresholds we often overlook. It was just past noon when the woman stepped onto the main platform at Hamburg's central station. Surveillance footage later revealed no signs of agitation, no pacing, no visible distress. She walked with calm steps, holding a bag that concealed a kitchen knife. Commuters passed by her, unaware they were moments away from something irreversible. The first attack came without warning. A man, stabbed in the side, staggered backwards in shock before collapsing. The attacker didn't run. She moved to the next person, then another, walking rather than sprinting. Witnesses later said it was the silence that struck them, the absence of screams from the attacker, the eerie stillness of her face as she moved through the crowd. In the span of minutes, 18 people had been wounded. Some suffered deep lacerations, others defensive wounds from instinctively trying to protect themselves. Chaos spread like wildfire. People screamed, ducked, ran. Security forces on site responded swiftly, but even with a quick reaction, the psychological damage had already been done. When officers reached her, she did not resist. She surrendered the knife quietly, her eyes unfocused, her hands trembling, but not from fear. What unfolded in those short minutes was not just an act of violence, it was a rupture, a breach between one woman's internal world and the external reality she could no longer process. And it all happened in a place designed for motion, transition, and direction. A station, by definition, is a point of passage. But that day, for 18 people, it became a place where time stopped, and where the question of what could have been done differently began echoing far louder than any siren. This timeline matters not for its precision, but for what it reveals. The slowness of her movements, the randomness of her targets, the complete disconnection between action and emotion. These are the fingerprints of a psyche not driven by hatred or vengeance, but by something far more disquieting: fragmentation. And so, we ask, could anyone have seen this coming? Was there a pattern before the attack? A whisper of deterioration ignored, dismissed or buried by a system too burdened to care? Let's now shift our focus inward, into the mind behind the blade. Not to excuse, but to examine. What do we know of her life, her mind, and the moments leading to that rupture? She wasn't a ghost, she wasn't invisible. Before the blood and headlines, she was simply a woman, 39 years old, quiet, fragile, known only by a first name to some neighbors who described her as polite but distant. She had lived in Hamburg for years, mostly in isolation. There were no close friends, no known family members regularly in contact. Her digital presence was minimal, her paper trail unremarkable. But in the silence of her life, a storm had been growing, one that no one seemed to notice until it finally broke. Reports indicate that she had a long-standing history of psychiatric issues. She had been hospitalized multiple times, including involuntary commitments. Diagnoses varied over the years: borderline personality disorder, schizoaffective symptoms, possible untreated paranoid psychosis. Each stay brought temporary stability, followed by release, and then silence, the familiar cycle. Her most recent discharge came just days before the attack, and that decision, made by professionals within a strained system, now stands as a critical fracture point in the entire timeline. What is most haunting isn't her history of illness. It's the absence of meaningful intervention. It's not uncommon for patients to minimize symptoms when under observation, especially those who learn the behavioral cues to earn discharge. And once released, the level of post-care support can be nearly non-existent, especially for those without family or advocates. So she returned to the world not healed, but unmonitored, invisible again, until the knife made her impossible to ignore. This is where the human complexity deepens. Mental illness alone does not predict violence. Most people with psychiatric diagnoses never harm anyone. But in her case, something had been deteriorating for a long time, and it appears no one was close enough to see how far the descent had gone. Have you ever recognized fragments of these patterns in ordinary people? The quiet withdrawal, the flat voice, the growing detachment? These are not always red flags that scream. Sometimes they whisper, and by the time anyone listens, it's already too late. In analyzing who she was, we don't seek sympathy, we seek clarity. Because behind the act lies a chain of missed moments, a biography of disconnection, and in those lost links, we find the foundation of everything that followed. Now, we need to look deeper into the mind itself, into the nature of her collapse. What was happening inside her? What mechanisms broke? Let's explore the psychological architecture behind her final spiral. To understand what erupted in Hamburg's central station that day, we must leave behind the surface and descend into a mind where logic and reality no longer held hands. Based on clinical reports and behavioral cues, her condition likely involved untreated or poorly managed psychosis, a disconnection so deep that external stimuli no longer register as stable or trustworthy. Within that frame, the station wasn't just a place. It could have felt like a threat, a hallucination, a message from a fractured internal world. Psychosis doesn't always present with violence, but when it does, it's often not driven by anger. Instead, it's a response to overwhelming confusion or terror, a defense against delusions that feel real. We may never know what she saw or heard in the seconds before she attacked. A face that transformed into a monster, a voice instructing her to act, a flood of images convincing her she was in danger. What we do know is this: the violence was likely not personal, but deeply internal. Her actions followed no clear narrative. The victims were chosen by proximity, not identity. That randomness tells us something critical. There was no coherent target, no ideological message. What unfolded was not a plan, but a rupture, It's possible she had been deteriorating long before her release, but masking it well enough to satisfy discharge protocols. And once alone, without structured support, her mind may have folded inward, compressing fear, confusion, and unmet needs into a single desperate expression: the knife. Mental health professionals sometimes refer to these moments as psychotic breaks, where the boundary between imagination and reality collapses, and the person becomes hostage to their own unfiltered thoughts. There's often a mixture of paranoia and persecution, believing others intend harm, reading danger in every shadow. Combine that with social isolation and a lack of treatment, and what emerges isn't just instability, it's unpredictability. But unpredictability isn't the same as randomness. Her mind may have followed a dark logic we don't yet understand, one shaped by trauma, mistrust, and years of quiet dissent. And in that darkness, the attack might have felt to her like a form of control, a moment where she wasn't lost, but in charge, however briefly. Understanding this doesn't excuse the act. It frames it. And in that framing, we can ask better questions. Not why did she do it, but what broke inside her, and why did no one see it breaking? Now, let's explore the other side of this story. The system that released her. Was this violence inevitable, or was it preventable? The woman who walked into Hamburg station wasn't an escapee. She wasn't lost between institutions. She had been officially released, cleared, declared fit to re-enter society. And yet within days, she unraveled in one of the busiest public spaces in Germany. This is where the analysis must move beyond her mind and into the systems that surround, define, and too often abandon people like her. Her case wasn't the first of its kind, and tragically, it won't be the last. Across many countries, psychiatric care exists in cycles: admit, stabilize, release. But stabilization is not recovery, and discharge does not mean healed. The system often rewards brief compliance and penalizes persistent need. Beds are scarce, time is limited, and decisions are made under pressure. Was she truly ready, or was she just quiet enough to no longer seem like a problem? What's more alarming is what often follows discharge: nothing. Many patients return to empty apartments, no therapy, no medication follow-up, and no one checking in. The illusion of support becomes the reality of neglect. And in that void, symptoms don't disappear, they regroup. When someone with severe psychiatric vulnerability is released without adequate follow-up, we gamble. And when that person acts out in a way that harms others, the blame is often scattered. Institutions deflect, protocols are reviewed, politicians gesture, but the cycle resumes. Overburdened systems push people through, not out of compassion, but necessity. The pressure is structural, the consequences are personal. In her case, it's unclear whether she missed appointments, refused medication, or simply fell through the cracks. What's clear is this: whatever safeguards were in place, they weren't enough. She needed more than a temporary bed. She needed sustained intervention, consistent observation, and someone, anyone, willing to see the quiet warning signs before they exploded into action. We must resist the temptation to frame this case as a singular failure. It is part of a pattern, one that repeats across borders and decades. A pattern where vulnerability is documented but not truly understood, where patients are released not because they are stable, but because the system is unstable. And so the question turns back to us. When institutions fail, who bears the cost? In this case, it was 18 strangers. But how many others walk beside us today, quietly deteriorating, one thought away from rupture? Next, we'll explore the consequences, not just for her, but for those she harmed. What does recovery look like for the unseen victims of spontaneous public violence? 18 people walked into Hamburg's central station that day, expecting the ordinary. A commute, a connection, a routine moment in transit. None of them knew they would become part of a collective trauma stitched together by randomness. The physical wounds varied, some shallow, others deep, But the deeper injury was psychological. What happens when your ordinary space becomes the site of sudden, inexplicable violence? How does the mind make sense of chaos without meaning? For some, the healing began quickly. Bandages, doctors, time. But for others, what lingered couldn't be sutured. Panic attacks in crowded places, flashbacks triggered by metal sounds, a constant sense of vulnerability in what used to feel safe. Survivors of public violence often struggle with what psychologists call ambient fear, a state where the world feels unpredictable and the self permanently exposed. Then there's the secondary wound, being attacked by someone with no personal motive, no robbery, no revenge, no ideology, just randomness. That kind of harm unravels the assumptions we make about control and threat. If there was no reason, how do we know it won't happen again? That uncertainty plants seeds of hypervigilance, insomnia, emotional withdrawal, scars that don't bleed, but don't fade either. Most of the victims declined interviews. A few released statements thanking emergency responders, expressing confusion, pain, disbelief. But the silence speaks too. Trauma doesn't always scream. Sometimes it buries itself. Sometimes it waits. And what of the attacker? She's back in a psychiatric facility, under tight security. The legal process will unfold slowly, complicated by her mental state. But for the survivors, justice isn't always about sentencing. It's about answers, about knowing why, about reclaiming the feeling of safety that was taken in seconds. This is the cruelty of random violence. It personalizes the impersonal. It invades without reason and leaves without apology. And in its wake, people are left not just with injuries, but with altered identities. They become victims in medical records and headlines, but also in their own sense of self. Who were they before that moment, and who have they become since? As we prepare to close this chapter, one final question remains. What happens to the minds that survive these moments? Not the ones who attack, but the ones who endure. Let's reflect on what this case teaches us, not just about mental illness, but about human resilience, institutional fragility, and the fine line between protection and exposure. What separates a fleeting thought from an irreversible act? A moment of clarity, a chemical imbalance, a lack of connection. The case of the Hamburg station stabbing doesn't offer clean answers. It offers discomfort. It challenges the idea that danger always announces itself, that illness follows predictable patterns, or that systems will catch those on the brink before they fall. What happened in those minutes was not just about one woman. It was about all the places where society quietly looks away. Her knife was real, her actions undeniable. But the root, that remains buried, beneath years of institutional fatigue, clinical misjudgment, and social abandonment. In the end, we are left with the question that haunts every case like this. Could it have been prevented? And if so, by whom? These questions don't demand outrage. They demand honesty, because unless we're willing to confront the systemic shadows that surround cases like this, we're doomed to repeat them again and again and again. Does understanding a mind like hers bring us closer to prevention, or does it simply deepen the mystery of what it means to lose control? I'd truly like to know your thoughts. What struck you the most about the psychology behind this case? Your reflections are essential to keeping this exploration alive. Feel free to share them in the comments. And if this kind of deep psychological inquiry resonates with you, consider checking if you're subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. This space isn't about judgment or glorification. It's about understanding the invisible mechanics behind real-world ruptures. We explore, we question, and we hold the discomfort together. If this episode helped you reflect, a like helps us bring more visibility to content that respects the complexity of the human mind and refuses to simplify it. Next time, we'll open another case, another mind, another descent into the unknown, and once again we'll ask the questions no one else dares to, not to excuse, but to reveal what hides beneath. See you in the next investigation.